$15 billion, signed not as aid, not as debt, but as defiance. The cameras flashed, the pens scratched, and the room hummed with the whispers of diplomats. Yet in that moment, what shook the earth was not a contract, but a declaration. A small, landlocked nation refusing to bow. For Burkina Faso, this pact with India is not just barrels of oil flowing eastward. It is the sound of chains snapping, a drumbeat announcing that Africa is no longer content to kneel. For decades, others defined the destiny of this soil. They called us poor, weak, dependent. But when Ibrahim Traoré sat across from Prime Minister Narendra Modi, history bent its arc. The question that echoes now is not simply whether this deal will work, but whether it can ignite something greater. Can a pact of steel, energy, and oil spark the fire of anti-colonial Africa? Can one nation's gamble awaken a continent? Do not look away. This moment may redraw the map of Africa. Subscribe and walk with us. $15 billion. That number echoed through headlines around the globe. But for Burkina Faso, it was more than digits inked on paper. It was a rupture in the script the world had grown used to. On one side of the polished mahogany table sat Ibrahim Traoré, a young leader often dismissed as reckless, too bold, too daring. On the other side, Prime Minister Narendra Modi, the voice of a nation of more than 1 billion people with an economy hungry for energy. Their handshake was not a courtesy. It was a statement. We will write our own terms. The contract was not built on the old foundation of loans disguised as lifelines or aid wrapped in pity. It was foreign direct investment, capital planted into the soil of Burkina Faso, with the expectation that both nations would harvest. $4 billion committed to oil extraction and refining, ensuring that the country would not be chained to the role of crude exporter. $5 billion into petrochemicals and energy infrastructure, pipelines, storage, and processing plants designed not just to serve India's thirst for oil, but to power Burkina Faso's own factories. $3 billion into steel and manufacturing. Rails, machines, and buildings forged in Ouagadougou and Bobo Dioulasso, rather than imported at high cost. And then came the $2 billion for defense. Not weapons delivered in crates stamped with foreign flags, but workshops and assembly lines on Burkinabe soil. Rifles built in Burkina Faso, armored vehicles rolling off local production lines, communication systems coded by local engineers. Finally, $1 billion into agriculture, telecommunications, and training, because sovereignty is not steel alone, but educated minds and fertile fields. This was the architecture of the pact. Oil for energy security, industry for employment, technology for training, and defense for sovereignty. But the contract was also layered with symbolism. For decades, the wealth beneath Burkina Faso's soil was treated as invisible, or worse, as spoils awaiting foreign extraction. Now, the same soil was reframed as fertile ground for partnership. The image was clear: a farmer watering dry earth, a miner breaking stone with bare hands, a child studying by candlelight. Their labor and their longing transformed into factories, power grids, and jobs. In public squares and markets across Ouagadougou, the figures were debated like scripture. $15 billion. Was it too good to be true? Taxi drivers, farmers, welders, and students all asked the same question: will this pact change my life? They had heard promises before. Too many deals had ended in disappointment. The profits siphoned abroad. Factories left as hollow shells. technology transfer locked away behind walls of bureaucracy. The people's doubt was not cynicism, it was memory. Still, the symbolism was undeniable. A small, landlocked nation stepping into a hall of global power, not to beg, not to borrow, but to bargain. Oil was the headline, but the deeper story was dignity. Every clause of the agreement seemed to whisper a challenge to the established order. Burkina Faso would no longer play the role of client state. It would stand as a partner. The press noted the atmosphere in the room when the pens moved. Traoré, carrying the weight of generations who had labored in silence. Modi, positioning India as a new kind of partner in Africa. One not seeking military bases or endless lectures, but energy for growth in exchange for industry and technology. To some, it was a transaction. To others, it was the first step in a longer journey. But investment is never neutral. Every drop of oil flowing eastward represents leverage. Every machine built locally is also a tie-binding Burkina Faso to India's economy. And while many celebrated the symbolism of sovereignty, others warned, even the brightest seeds can wither if not cultivated with discipline. The soil of Burkina Faso has carried many broken promises before. Will this time be different? The ink has dried, the signatures are sealed. But in a land scarred by betrayal, can $15 billion truly plant a harvest for its people? I felt the West tremble. With those words, Ibrahim Traoré captured the essence of the moment. The pact was not only about oil and steel, it was about shifting the center of gravity. For decades, Burkina Faso had been treated as too small to matter, too dependent to rise. Yet here was a young leader claiming a future beyond dependency, and the world could not ignore it. The tremor was not just felt in Ouagadougou. In Washington, policy analysts whispered about the precedent. In Paris, the corridors of power buzzed with unease. What if other former colonies followed the same path? In Brussels, headlines framed the deal as a dangerous turn, while in Beijing, the pact was read as competition for influence on the continent. The very act of choosing India was itself a declaration. No longer chained to old alliances, Burkina Faso could pick partners that matched its vision, not its shackles. Yet the louder reaction came not from foreign capitals, but from the streets of Burkina Faso. In the markets of Kaya, welders of Koudougou, students of Bobo Dioulasso, people debated in hushed tones and open arguments. Hope glimmered in their words. Perhaps this time the promises would not vanish into foreign bank accounts. Perhaps this time the light bulbs would flicker to life. The factories would hum. The workshops would employ their youth. For a farmer bending under the sun, the idea of tractors and irrigation systems born from this pact was more than politics. It was survival. Still, suspicion was never far away. Too many contracts had been celebrated before, only to rot in corruption and neglect. A taxi driver listening to the radio shook his head. "Another promise," he muttered. The people were not naive. They knew that investment came with expectations, with profit, with influence. They had been burned by fine words and grand ceremonies. To believe again would take more than speeches. It would take lived change. Traoré's rhetoric reached for the heart. He spoke of farmers watering dry soil with sweat, of miners laboring under foreign flags, of children studying by candlelight. His words carried the weight of a generation silenced by dependency. But what made the rhetoric resonate was not only its poetry, it was its defiance. When he declared that the West did not fear African weakness, but African awakening, he gave voice to something larger than a contract. He cast the pact as a turning point, not for Burkina Faso alone, but for a continent. And indeed, across Africa, the whispers spread. From Accra to Dakar, From Bamako to Abidjan, leaders and citizens alike asked whether this was the beginning of a new chapter. If Burkina Faso, landlocked and underestimated, could bargain on equal terms with a rising power, why not them? Could this be the first domino in a chain of African awakenings? Or was it simply another headline destined to fade? The symbolism of breaking away from aid was powerful. Aid, Traoré argued, had been a leash, tying nations to masters. This pact, he insisted, was different. Oil for industry, investment for modernization, sovereignty for respect. The contrast was stark, the message unmistakable. Not charity, not pity, a partnership of equals. But every rise invites resistance. Already, rumors of sabotage and destabilization circulated. Could the West accept a Burkina Faso that no longer knelt? Could regional elites, long tied to foreign networks, accept factories and weapons stamped "Made in Burkina Faso"? Traoré himself acknowledged the risks, that corruption could poison the promise, that influence could creep in unseen, that hope could once again turn to betrayal. Still, the mood was unmistakable. A young leader had thrown down a gauntlet, not just to his own people, but to the world, a challenge to those who doubted Africa's ability to choose its own path. The pact became a mirror. To some, it reflected dignity and hope. To others, danger and hubris. But either way, it commanded attention. If this pact rattles empires abroad and stirs hope at home, what storms may it unleash in the fragile balance of power within Burkina Faso itself? Every great contract is more than ink. It is impact. For Burkina Faso, the true test of the $15 billion pact is not in the headlines, but in the homes, farms, and streets where ordinary people live. The question, whispered in Ouagadougou's markets and shouted in village squares, is simple. Will this deal change my life? In the short term, the agreement promises thousands of jobs. Factories rising from the soil will need welders, engineers, machinists. Power plants will light schools and hospitals, replacing candlelight with electricity. Steel workshops will forge the rails and tools of tomorrow. Farmers may see irrigation systems and mechanized plows replacing the sweat of hand labor. The immediate vision is one of work, wages, and dignity. In the medium term, the transformation could be deeper still. Burkina Faso's economy has long been trapped in the cycle of raw export and imported dependency. This pact, if honored, offers a way out. By processing oil locally, by building petrochemical plants, by producing steel at home, the nation begins to climb the ladder of value-added production. A barrel of oil is no longer just crude to be shipped abroad. It becomes fuel, plastics, and power feeding local industry. The social consequences would be profound. Youth, often driven to despair or migration, could find paths in engineering, manufacturing, and modern agriculture. A generation that has seen opportunity only in leaving may instead see a future in staying. Education, too, would be transformed. As training programs link classrooms to factories, giving students not only knowledge, but skills to earn a living. Yet optimism is shadowed by memory. Too often, Africa's grand projects have been drained by corruption. Factories promised, but never completed. Contracts signed, but never delivered. Funds siphoned into accounts far from home. Burkinabe citizens know these stories well. Their caution is not cynicism, but survival. For this pact to succeed, transparency must be more than a slogan. It must be the sword cutting through the fog of corruption. Politically, the pact shifts the balance of power. By investing in defense technology, Burkina Faso signals an intent to build sovereignty not only in economics, but in security. No longer renting protection from abroad, the nation seeks to manufacture its own weapons and train its own engineers. This is both empowerment and risk. Empowerment, because it reduces dependency. Risk, because it may draw the nation into new rivalries, with critics warning of entanglements in India's conflicts with China or Pakistan. Still, sovereignty is not without price. To stand tall is to invite pressure. Regional bodies like ECOWAS may weigh the pact with suspicion, while France and the European Union monitor closely. Yet for many in Burkina Faso, the calculation is clear. Better to stumble toward freedom than to march smoothly in chains. It is here that the deal takes on continental significance. This is not only about factories in Ouagadougou. It is about a narrative spreading across Africa. For too long, nations were told to wait, to beg, to depend. Now, the pact is framed as part of Anti-Colonial Africa, a wider awakening that refuses to let history repeat itself. Each job created, each light switched on, each machine built is a declaration that Africa will not remain a reservoir of cheap labor and raw resources. And yet, every declaration demands proof. A taxi driver, hearing the news on the radio, asks, "Will this bring fuel prices down for me?" A farmer in Kaya wonders whether tractors will reach his fields. A student in Kudugu prays that training programs will open doors, not just slogans. If the pact does not reach them, then history's grand words will once again feel like betrayal. This is the knife's edge upon which Burkina Faso now stands. A chance to transform society, to ignite pride and hope, but also a risk of disappointment that could fuel unrest. For Traoré, the gamble is not only economic, it is political survival. His legitimacy will not be measured in speeches, but in the hum of machines, the glow of streetlights, the pay in workers' hands. For every light switched on in Ouagadougou, shadows of old corruption still linger. Will Burkina Faso's new dawn banish them, or will they return to darken the harvest once more? The ink on the $15 billion pact did not only echo in Ouagadougou, it reverberated across the world. For the West, the agreement was more than an economic headline. It was a challenge to a system that had long relied on Africa's dependency. Washington framed it cautiously, analysts debating whether Burkina Faso was drifting out of the orbit of the dollar. Paris reacted with sharper unease, for the pact struck at the heart of France's lingering influence through the CFA franc. Brussels, too, read the deal as a signal of shifting alliances, one that might weaken Europe's leverage in the Sahel. India, by contrast, celebrated. For New Delhi, this was not merely energy security, but strategic presence. By planting sheepsel in Burkina Faso's soil, India positioned itself as a partner of equals in Africa, a contrast to both Western aid and Chinese infrastructure loans. Indian media spoke of a new Silk Road stretching across the Sahara, binding Asia and Africa in trade, technology, and energy. China observed with caution. Beijing has long invested billions in Africa, but often on its terms. The arrival of India as a rival investor raises questions of competition, overlap, and influence. Could Burkina Faso become a stage where great powers test their models of partnership? Or would it manage to balance the rivalries and safeguard its sovereignty? African institutions watched with a mixture of pride and apprehension. The African Union praised the symbolism of a nation refusing to bow. ECOWAS, however, weighed the risks of destabilization. A bold shift in alliances could unsettle regional balance, especially if perceived as an affront to traditional partners. Yet across many African capitals, from Accra to Dakar, the mood was curious and hopeful. Could this be a template, Could other nations also strike deals based on trade, not charity? The most controversial element was financial. By exploring settlements outside the dollar, by whispering of rupee franc transactions, Burkina Faso dared to poke the heart of Western dominance, the financial order itself. For decades, oil, gas, and gold were priced in the currencies of others. This pact offered a glimpse of an alternative. It was not just economics, it was rebellion written in numbers. Still, sovereignty is fragile. To claim African sovereignty requires more than signing contracts. It requires discipline, transparency, and resilience against foreign manipulation. Burkina Faso's experiment may inspire, but it will also be tested. Every ally gained risks, creating a rival offended. Every declaration of independence risks attracting pressure. But sovereignty without security is a fragile castle. Who will defend its walls when empires lean against them? Every pact is a gamble, and this $15 billion deal is no exception. Burkina Faso now stands before two diverging roads, each leading to a future carved not by destiny, but by discipline. In the best case, the vision becomes reality. Factories hum with the sound of production. Thousands of jobs bloom in steel, petrochemicals, and modern agriculture. Engineers, trained under Indian programs, design technologies that power new industries. Farmers see their yields double with modern equipment. Villages long lit only by candles glow with electricity. Students, once dreaming of opportunities abroad, find careers at home, coding software, building machines, and shaping Africa's future with their own hands. In this scenario, Burkina Faso transforms from a raw exporter into a hub, a bridge linking Africa and Asia. And as it rises, neighbors in Mali, Ghana, and Senegal may follow the path, sparking a continental wave of industrial awakening. Yet the worst case lurks close by. Corruption seeps in like poison. Contracts are mismanaged, funds siphoned, factories reduced to empty shells, controlled by foreign bosses, while locals remain laborers. The profits flow abroad. Citizens, betrayed again, take to the streets in anger. The pact collapses into another broken promise, another stone in the graveyard of African dreams. The West, pointing fingers, declares, "See, Africa cannot govern itself," using failure as proof that dependency must continue. This line between glory and betrayal is thin. The difference will not be made in ceremonies, but in vigilance. Transparency must become daily practice. Leaders must resist temptation. Citizens must hold their government accountable. Only then can hope endure. The path ahead is more than national. It is continental. If Burkina Faso succeeds, Africa will not only rise in dignity, it will write a new map of power. If it fails, the skeptics will be emboldened, and the chains of dependency may tighten again. History has given Burkina Faso a seed. Whether it grows into a harvest or withers in the soil depends on every hand that tends it. History will not wait. Will Africa seize this chance, or let it slip into the shadows of broken promises once more? The story of Burkina Faso has long been written in the margins of empires, but with the stroke of a pen, a different chapter has begun. This $15 billion pact is not merely oil, steel, or factories. It is a wager on sovereignty, a blueprint for dignity, a declaration that a small nation will no longer beg, but bargain. Yet even as the cameras fade and the headlines pass, the true test begins. Will the farmer in Kaya feel the harvest change? Will the student in Kudugu see a brighter classroom? Will the welder in Ouagadougou hear the steady hum of machines born from this pact? These questions will decide whether history remembers this moment as breakthrough or betrayal. The stakes are not confined to one nation. From Dakar to Accra, from Bamako to Abidjan, Africa watches. If Burkina Faso succeeds, the continent will see proof that dependency is not destiny. This pact may ignite a broader awakening, a movement we might one day call Anti-Colonial Africa. But if it fails, skeptics will sneer, and the old order will tighten its grip once more. Still, even risk carries its own kind of courage. To stumble toward freedom is nobler than to walk smoothly in chains. What Traoré has signed is more than a contract. It is a seed planted in African soil, a seed of factories, power, jobs, and hope. And though it faces storms of sabotage, whispers of corruption, and pressures from empires, the soil of struggle may yet yield a harvest of sovereignty. The world will watch in 5 years, in 10 years, to see what fruit grows. But Africa cannot wait for others to write its story. The pen lies in African hands, and it is time to inscribe a future of independence. If you believe Africa deserves its own voice, stay with us. Subscribe, share, and let this story echo beyond borders.